Okay, so yesterday on Skittles Island, you saw a little tiny population that washed up on an island, sort of formed the basis for the entire population of this, we won't even call it a civilization, but this entire little ecosystem. So what do we call the fact that if you've got a small founding population, you're not going to get new genes very often in that population? So like some of you, there were no yellow Skittles on your island. You never got yellow Skittles. What do we call that idea? I said it wasn't on your vocabulary list, but you should write it down on the front page. Founder effect, yeah. There's a really good real-life example of founder effect, and I don't know that we'll get to work in the paper lab on this, but how many of you have ever seen someone who is Amish? Okay. The Amish in the U.S. are all the descendants of about 200 families that came from southern Germany and Switzerland in the, I want to say, early 1800s. So 200 families. It's a pretty small number of people. But they tend to have large families. They've done well. They've reproduced extensively. But founder effect is visible in Amish population. And here's the other thing about the Amish. They tend to not marry outside the faith. So Amish people tend to marry Amish people. People who leave the Amish community are the only ones who marry outside the Amish community. So you've got a couple things. You have a small founding population, and you have a group that mates inside their group. There are geneticists love the Amish. They've been the subject of a lot of genetic studies because there are genes found in concentrations in the Amish population that are not found anyplace else. There's one form of dwarfism that affects it's something like 1 in a million people outside the Amish community, but within the Amish community it's like 1 in 1,000, significantly higher rates because those genes were present in the founding population, and you have a sort of closed gene pool in some ways, so you have limited variation. Okay, so we had the founder effect in the Skittles lab yesterday, but there were some questions for you on genetic drift. So remember we talked about with Hardy-Weinberg, for a population to be in equilibrium, typically the population has to have what? No mutations happening. Well, we met that. The population has to be large or small? Large. You have to have big populations. Did you have a big population on Skittles Island? No. Tiny. That's a tiny little population. When we're talking large, we're talking thousands or tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of individuals. You had a very tiny population. So the question that was asked, okay, for all but one group, their populations were not in equilibrium. We had one group that happened to end up in equilibrium. We'll talk about them later. Couldn't imagine that would have happened, but it did. Cool. For the rest of you, your populations were changing. They were evolving. So we said, okay, when populations aren't evolving, they're in genetic equilibrium. When they are evolving, what causes them to evolve in particular directions? What causes them to evolve in particular directions? This idea of genetic drift is a huge idea in small populations. So, genetic drift, what does it mean to drift? What is it? Oh, it can, yeah, in relationships. We drifted apart. What if I put you in a canoe on Highlandtown Reservoir and set you adrift? What would that mean? So if I set you out to drift on Highlandtown in a canoe, what have I done? Huh? Okay. Do you have any paddles or oars if you're set to drift?
Yeah, you're just with the current.
You're just out there. Yeah, you may come back to shore. You may be out there for quite a while. Drifting means you're just going aimlessly. You're just going where the current takes you, going where the wind takes you. You're not directing it in any way. Genetic drift is the idea that within a population, gene frequencies and trait frequencies, so the basis of evolution, can kind of drift due to random chance. If there's no real strong selective pressure on something, then stuff just happens. People get lucky or unlucky. So you might have the best genes in the world. You might still get struck by lightning. You might have the best genes in the world and you get, hit by a bus. You might have the best genes in the world and something else horrible happens to you. I don't know, a tree falls on you. You might have really crappy genes and you happen to reproduce. Every now and then it happens that somebody has spontaneous quintuplets. Do you know what quintuplets are? 5 babies born at once. And usually that's the result of fertility drugs, but there have been a few cases of people who had what are called spontaneous quintuplets. They weren't using any kind of fertility drugs. They just got pregnant the old-fashioned way, and oh my God, that's 5 babies. Maybe you have the worst. It's random. It's chance. Maybe you have the worst genes in the world, but you randomly get pregnant with 5 babies. You're passing on a higher percentage of your genes. So there's this idea, genetic drift is it's the gene frequencies going in no direction but what random chance gives you. In a big population, it's not such a big deal. Genetic drift doesn't really show up in large populations because So in large populations, there are lots of individuals with really good genes, lots of individuals with really crappy genes. Random chance doesn't play as much of a role. It's unlikely that there's going to be one individual who has the only copy of, or the only copies of this particular gene, or is the only one who shows this particular trait. But in a small population, it's a very real possibility. So when you did the Skittles lab yesterday, if you had something like this, so if this is my founding population, first of all, I have founder effect here. What colors are not represented? Any?
Red.
Yeah, no red. And I've only got one purple. So I don't have a whole lot of purple. Maybe purple is actually the fittest color in this lab. And you're welcome to take a shot of the screen if you want for your discussion. So we have no red. We have limited purple. We've got more yellow and orange than anything else. So we're seeing founder effect. Not all possibilities are represented. What if there's a random predator operating here and they eat the purple one? They weren't selectively eating the purple ones. They were just randomly eating whatever they closed their eyes and grabbed, but they happened to grab that purple one. What has happened to purple in this population? Yeah, it's been eliminated. There are no more purple Skittles. That's the effect of random chance on a small population. Now, if you had a larger population, like the whole bag, what would be the odds that somebody would randomly grab all the purple? Pretty low. Pretty low. But in a very small population, it's very possible that one particular trait can be completely eliminated just due to random chance. And, that's part of the risk of small populations. So the bigger the population, the less of a risk that is. In small populations, the role of chance is huge in altering gene frequencies. And that's this image here. And I got to tell you, when I was looking, Gesundheit, at the test materials for the PARC test in biology, they actually had a question exactly like this. They showed 3 charts for gene frequencies with 3 different population sizes, and you had to match them up. So, this is a very small population. It says N equals 20. So 20 individuals, that's tiny. And those jaggedy lines show the distribution of a particular trait over time. And you'll notice that in some of them, let's see if we can blow that up a little bit more. In this line, this trait becomes completely dominant. And this trait completely disappears. A lot of these traits just swing wildly. Well, the bigger the population, so here's a population that's 10 times that size, 200 individuals. Nothing completely disappears. Nothing becomes all there is. So you have a smaller role of chance. And if you get up into a population of 2,000, so 100 times the size of the first population, everything stays pretty consistent over time. Whatever traits these are we're looking at remain pretty much in equilibrium. They kind of hover around the mid-mark. But that's not the case in these small populations. Small populations have some very real risks. Small populations tend to be a little bit less diverse. Do you know what the term inbreeding means? What does it mean?
Inbreed with someone of your own family.
Okay, we very often use it to mean like reproduction within, close families. You marry your 3rd cousin, and your kids marry their 4th cousin, and their kids marry their 2nd cousin, and you're sharing a lot of the same genes to start with. There's not a whole lot of genetic information that's coming from the outside. Small populations tend to be fairly inbred. When I was a kid, Franklin Square over by Salem, the joke was that Franklin Square shut down 1 day a week. They called it Heritage Day, but it was really just their family reunion. That every single family in Franklin Square was all related. It was this little tiny town, and they were all descended from 2 immigrants from Italy in the early 1900s. I don't know if that was true, but that was the joke. That this little tiny town, they were all related. And that's very often the case in small towns, but usually somewhere along the line you've gotten some fresh genes into the mix. Somebody moved in, or somebody found a spouse or a mate or a partner outside of town, married, somebody from Pittsburgh, somebody from Youngstown, somebody from another town. So they infuse some fresh genes into the gene pool. Small populations carry some real risks, and genetic drift is one of them. You can end up, so for whatever trait this red line represents, it ends up being that every single individual in this population has the same version of that trait. Maybe they all have blue eyes. Maybe they all have long ears. I don't know what it is. But, in small populations, genetic drift plays a big part. The role of chance gets smaller as the population gets larger. And when you get up into these big populations, like I said, chance is unlikely to completely eliminate something from the gene pool, or chance is unlikely to have you end up with everyone identical. So take a second now and look at your distributions, and I want you to think about, in your case, especially for the random predators, what role did chance play in changing your distributions? So for this Skittle Island, did you have all colors represented initially? Okay, you had no orange. So you had some founder effect. You didn't have full variety of traits to start with, but you did have some red. But randomly, all the red Skittles got eaten. So we see that in the very end, you've completely eliminated one color option is gone. So there's a lack of variety there. Variety is really good. Did you guys eliminate anything by chance?
Yellow.
Okay, so you had a founder effect also. You had no orange and green to start, and yellow got randomly eaten. So, you weren't intentionally preying on the yellow Skittles, but by random chance, they all got eliminated. Okay, so you remember we said, this is, and I popped back a slide to kind of review. So we said that a population can end up in genetic equilibrium if there are no major mutations, we don't have any immigration or emigration, we have a big population, mating is random, and there's no selection. So we kind of talked about mutations, migration, we talked about population size and how genetic drift affects small populations. What would random mating be? What would that mean? Okay, well, first of all, let me tell you that humans don't do random mating. We don't. Random mating means there is absolutely no selection criteria whatsoever. So there is no thought process, there is no selection whatsoever in terms of who mates with who. So plants do this. I've already told you, right, that when you come out in the spring and your car is covered in pollen, that's plant sperm. I told you that? So you can walk into your house and say to your parents, oh my gosh, the cars are all covered in sperm. Won't they be thrilled? They'll probably do a double take. That's just plant sperm. So it goes out on the wind. Whatever female flower it hits, that's who they reproduce with. There is no selection whatsoever. Pollen can travel for miles on the wind. You get a good pollen cloud above a forest, like a pine forest. Pine trees are really known for producing a lot of pollen. You get a good pollen cloud, that pollen cloud can travel for miles. Little grains of pollen dropping off here and there to fertilize whatever trees they encounter. Corals are another one. So this is a marine coral. It's an aquatic ocean dwelling organism. And that cloud coming up from the coral is sperm. And that sperm, all the corals release all their sperm at one time. All the male corals. And all the corals also release all their eggs at one time. So there's just this giant cloud of eggs and sperm. And what eggs get fertilized by what sperm? Anybody's guess. These are, I'm trying to remember what species they are now. They're a trout species, I think. And they all end up in this big area, and everybody releases all their stuff at one time. Woohoo! And then they all swim away. What gets fertilized? Who knows? That's random mating. Okay? I think with the other example, yeah, this is another plant pollen. And this is pine pollen. You can see the clouds starting to form. If you go out in the spring and shake pine trees, very often you'll get a cloud of pollen. If you have allergies, you will regret doing that, but you will get a cloud of pollen. So that's random mating. Most species don't do this. Most animal species don't do this, I should say. There are some selection criteria for selecting a mate. So in deer, who gets to mate? Every year, who gets to mate? Okay, and it's not the big buck, yeah. Yes. It's not a pack hierarchy, so we don't typically use the term alpha, but yeah, the dominant buck gets to mate. How does he get to be dominant? He's bigger, he's stronger, he's got a better rack, he's fighting off other bucks, and the females like him. They select him. He competes for a place in their hearts. There is a selection criteria being used. Okay, so what are some of the kinds of selection criteria that species can use? So when you mate selectively, 3 basic kinds of selective mating. Mating with whoever's nearby. That's a kind of selection. It's called proximity mating. The human sort of metaphor for this would be marrying the girl next door or the boy next door. Marrying somebody you grew up with. That's proximity mating. Mating those that look like you. Have you ever noticed that very often people do date people who look like they could fit right into their own family? That's assortative mating. People tend, not always, but a lot of people, there's a biological attraction to people who kind of look like they have similar genes to you. And then there are people who break type and go with people who look like they have very different genes from you. And the last one is mating with those that have what look like good traits. And I've got that elk there. Things like the big buck who proves that he's really strong. He's showing females, he doesn't mean to do this, but he's showing females that, hey, if you mate with me, your offspring will be strong. Your offspring will stand a chance at being the big buck someday. That's sexual selection. So looking at a mate in terms of what traits they have that would benefit your own offspring. I want you to go to the vocabulary sheet. And based on our conversation here, I want you to look at words that you can now define.